They say life's a roller coaster, but man, I didn't sign up for this one. It all started back when I was 42. Met this woman, vibrant, full of life, but with demons of her own. Addiction, it's a beast. We had our share of ups and downs, kind of like a dance, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I remember this one time, early on, we were at this cozy little dive bar, the kind with dim lights and a jukebox stuck in the 80s. She was all smiles, laughter echoing over the clink of glasses. But as the night wore on, her eyes got that glazed look, and I knew we were in for trouble. That was the first time I saw the addiction take hold. It was like watching a storm cloud cover the sun. Cheating, yeah, that happened. Stumbled upon her once at a friend's party. Upstairs, not alone. Man, that stung. I walked out, heart in my throat, feeling like the world's biggest fool. But when she came after me, all tears and apologies, I caved. Love does that to you, makes you see past the hurt. Getting her into rehab was a journey in itself. Convincing her, dealing with the fallout, it was messy. But when she got out, it was like the woman I met came back to life. We had this beautiful moment on the beach one evening, just after her rehab. She told me, with the sunset painting the sky, that she wanted to start fresh. I believed her, we believed in us. Our wedding, picture perfect, her in white, me in a suit that I swear was trying to choke me. Our families were there, her mom crying, my dad patting me on the back so hard I thought I'd fall over. We danced under the stars, and for that moment, all the past troubles seemed like a distant memory. Everyone kept saying how we were meant to be, a perfect match. I guess we bought into that fairy tale. The honeymoon phase was something else. We did those couple things, brunch on Sundays, movie nights on Fridays. I got used to her being there, her toothbrush next to mine, her perfume lingering in the bathroom. We'd argue over silly things, who left the milk out, why the toilet seat was up, the usual married life quirks. But as the days turned into months, I started noticing the little signs. A missed call here, an unexplained absence there. I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was off. It's like when you know a storm's coming, you can feel it in the air, but you hope you're wrong. Looking back, I guess our foundation was always a bit shaky, built on hope and a whole lot of ignoring the obvious. But I loved her, man. I really did, and I thought that would be enough. Turns out, love's not a cure-all. It's more like a band-aid on a bullet wound, helps for a bit, but eventually you're gonna have to deal with the damage. So there we were, setting up our little home, pictures on the wall, plants in the window. But beneath it all, there were cracks, and no amount of plaster could cover them up. I just didn't want to see them, Love makes you optimistic or maybe just blind. But hey, that's just the start of the story. There's more to it, a lot more. Buckle up, because this ride's just getting started. That first year of tying the knot? Pure bliss, like something out of a cheesy romance flick. We were those lovebirds you'd see in the park, annoyingly cute and all wrapped up in each other. I'd wake up to her singing in the kitchen, off-key but beautiful in a way that only your better half can be. And she'd laugh at my terrible attempts at making breakfast in bed, scrambled eggs that were more like a culinary crime scene. Weekends were our little adventures. We'd hop into the car, no destination in mind, just driving until we found something interesting. Could be a small-town fair, a hidden hiking trail, or a beach that wasn't on any map. It was like we were rediscovering the world together. She'd take a million photos, each one with that radiant smile of hers that could light up the darkest of places. Evenings were about Netflix and takeout, arguing over what to watch, ending up watching something neither of us really liked. But it didn't matter because it was about being together. We'd fall asleep on the couch, her head on my chest, the TV still murmuring in the background. Our friends would say we were goals. We'd host these little dinner parties that somehow always turned into impromptu dance-offs. She was a terrible dancer, but man, did she have spirit. Watching her groove with that awkward yet endearing rhythm was one of my favorite sights. But as we cruised into the second year, things started shifting, subtle at first. We'd bicker over small stuff while the dishes were piling up, whose turn it was to take out the trash, the usual cohabitation gripes. At first, it was just the ebb and flow of marriage, like adjusting to a new rhythm. But it felt like we were slowly moving out of sync. Work stress didn't help. I was grinding away at my job, trying to earn a decent living, while she was figuring out her own career path. Our conversation started shifting from dreams and aspirations to bills and responsibilities. The weight of reality was creeping into our little bubble. We stopped going on our random weekend trips. Saturdays became about grocery shopping and catching up on household chores. Sundays were for lounging, but more like coexisting in the same space rather than enjoying each other's company. We were still in love, but it was like we were forgetting how to show it. And then there were the silences. Those moments when you realize you're not talking because you're comfortable, but because you're out of things to say. We'd sit at dinner, chatting about mundane stuff, but the laughter and deep conversations of the past were becoming rare gems. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't all doom and gloom. We had our moments of spontaneous romance, like when she surprised me with tickets to my favorite band or when I planned a candlelit dinner at home. But these moments were flickers of light in what was slowly becoming a routine existence. As year 2 dawned, I started wondering if this was what married life was supposed to be. Just a cycle of good times and not so good times, a test of patience and love. I guess I was naive, thinking love was all about the highs. I was learning that it also meant navigating the lows together. So there we were, stepping into another year of our journey. Not quite the same starry-eyed couple, but holding on, believing we could find our way back to those carefree days. Little did I know, the real challenges were just around the corner. Year 3, that's when our marriage train hit the wall. She slipped back into her old ways, the bottle becoming her secret companion again. It wasn't just a sip here and there, it was full-blown nights of oblivion. I'd find empty bottles tucked away in the weirdest places, behind the couch, in the laundry basket, even in the trunk of her car. The night she cheated, man, that was a gut punch like no other. I came home late from work. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then I saw them, her and a so-called friend of mine, tangled up on our very own living room couch. The air got sucked right out of my lungs. I remember just standing there, frozen, while my whole world crumbled. Confronting her was a mix of rage, disbelief, and a weird sense of pity. She was remorseful, or at least she seemed to be. Her eyes, once full of life, were now just hollow. She blamed the alcohol, said she didn't remember much. I wanted to scream, to rage, but what was the point? The damage was done. I laid down the law, no more alcohol. It was that or I was out. She agreed, tearfully promised it was her last slip. We even started in a couples therapy, sitting in this sterile room with a guy who nodded a lot and offered cliché advice. But hey, we were trying, right? Things did get better for a bit. She threw herself into painting, her old passion. The house started filling up with canvases, splashes of color that seemed to scream all the things she couldn't say out loud. We'd spend evenings just talking about her art, and it felt like we were reconnecting. But the underlying issues, they were still there, simmering. Trust, once broken, isn't easily mended. I'd lie awake at night, listening to her breathing, wondering if she was really asleep or just pretending, like me. Work became my escape. I'd stay late, take on extra projects, anything to avoid going home to face the uncertainty. Our social life took a nosedive too. Friends stopped coming around, invitations dried up. It was like we had this big sign on our front door saying, "Dysfunctional couple, approach with caution." I missed the laughter, the carefree banter, but who wants to hang around a sinking ship? And then there were the whispers. People talking behind your back, pitying glances, the whole 9 yards. Walking into a room felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone knew your lines except you. The year trudged on, each day a carbon copy of the last. We were two strangers living under the same roof, going through the motions of a life we once dreamt up. That spark, that crazy, beautiful connection we had, it was fading, and I didn't know how to reignite it. So there we were, at the end of year 3, standing at a crossroads. One path led to giving up, walking away from the wreckage. The other, a steep, rocky climb towards something that resembled healing. The question was, did we have the strength to take that climb? Or had we already fallen too far? Working in the same office with her, you'd think it'd be a dream, right? Seeing your better half every day, coffee breaks together. But nah, it was more like a nightmare in disguise. Gossip spreads like wildfire in close quarters, and soon enough, whispers about her started doing the rounds. Started off as vague murmurs, nothing concrete. Hushed tones in the break room, abruptly stopping when I walked in. You know the feeling, like you've just missed the punchline of a joke everyone else is in on. Then came the not-so-subtle glances, the pitying looks. It's the stuff paranoia is made of. I confronted her, of course. We'd be in our little home, a place that once felt like a sanctuary, now more like a stage for our nightly arguments. She'd deny everything, her voice rising, eyes welling up with frustration or maybe guilt. Hard to tell. I wanted to believe her. God knows I did. But it's tough when your gut and your heart are playing tug of war. One particularly rough evening, it all came to a head. We were sitting at the dinner table, the silence between us louder than any argument. I just blurted it out, asked her point blank if the rumors were true. She slammed her fork down, said I was being paranoid, unreasonable. That was I, when every sign pointed to something being off. The drive to work became my daily dose of dread. Stepping into the office felt like entering a minefield, never knowing when the next rumor would explode. I catch snippets of conversations, her name, mixed with laughter or scorn, and each time it was like a knife twisting in my gut. Then there was this one colleague, let's call him Mark, he'd been a good friend, or so I thought, started acting weird around me, avoiding eye contact, making excuses to leave when I showed up. One day, I cornered him, asked him straight up if he knew anything. He just mumbled some nonsense and hurried off. But the look in his eyes, it said enough. Our home life became a series of cold interactions, like two roommates who couldn't stand each other. We'd sit in front of the TV, not speaking, barely acknowledging one another. Sometimes, I'd catch her staring into space, lost in thought, and I'd wonder where her mind was wandering off to. Sleepless nights became my new norm. I'd lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every rumor, every argument, trying to piece together the puzzle. Was she really cheating? Or was I losing my mind? The uncertainty was a constant weight, pressing down on everything. Despite it all, there were these fleeting moments when the woman I fell in love with would reappear. A shared joke, a brief smile, a reminder of what we used to have. It was those moments that kept me hanging on, hoping against hope that we could get back to that place. But as the rumors kept swirling, my doubts grew. It was like living in a fog, every step uncertain, every word second-guessed. I wanted to shake her, to scream for the truth, but what good would that do? If she was lying, would she suddenly confess just because I raised my voice? So, there I was, stuck between wanting to trust the woman I loved and feeling like a fool for even considering it. Rumors and doubts, man, they're a toxic mix. They seep into your bones, poison everything, till you don't know what to believe anymore. That Friday started like any other. I left for work with a peck on her cheek, the usual "have a good day" thrown over my shoulder. But man, I had no idea what was waiting for me at home. It was around noon when my boss told me I could leave early. Take some time, you've been working hard, he said. I remember feeling grateful for the unexpected break. Thought maybe I'd surprise her. Maybe we could grab lunch or something. Little did I know. Pulling into our driveway, the first thing I noticed was this unfamiliar truck parked there. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe it's just a friend, I told myself, trying to push down the rising tide of panic. But deep down, I knew. Walking into the house, it was too quiet, the kind of silence that screams something's wrong. And then I heard it, the sounds, those unmistakable sounds coming from our bedroom. My steps felt like lead, each one heavier than the last. I reached the bedroom door, and there it was, the scene that shattered my world. My wife with our supervisor in our bed, in the home we built together. I stood there, frozen, as everything inside me crumbled. It's funny how in moments like that, time seems to both stop and race. A million thoughts crashed through my mind. Anger, pain, disbelief. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I couldn't move. I was just broken. Finally, I managed to tear myself away. I stumbled out of the house, got into my car, and just drove. I had no destination, no plan, Streets and buildings blurred past me as I drove aimlessly, trying to outrun the pain. But you can't outrun something that's inside you. I found myself on this old country road, far from the city, far from everything. And that's when it hit me. I just broke down. Right there, alone in my car. Tears, man, I hadn't cried like that since I was a kid, but it was like a dam had burst inside me. All the hurt, the betrayal, it just poured out. The rest of the day was a blur. I don't even remember how I got back home. But when I did, they were gone. The house felt so empty, like a shell. I wandered from room to room, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no sense to be made. Just a deep, aching void where my trust and love used to be. I ended up in our living room, surrounded by all these memories, photos of us on the wall, souvenirs from trips we took, gifts we gave each other. It all felt like a lie now. I felt like a fool for believing, for hoping, for loving. That night I didn't sleep. I just sat there, in the dark, replaying it all over in my head. The signs were there, I guess. Maybe I just chose to ignore them. Or maybe I was too scared to face the truth. But there it was, stark and undeniable. That Friday changed everything. It was the day my marriage, the life I thought I had, all of it just shattered. And I was left to pick up the pieces, not even sure where to start or if it was even worth the effort. Walking back into that house after what I'd seen felt like stepping into a battlefield. Everything was a reminder of the betrayal. The pictures on the walls mocked me. The silence screamed at me. She wasn't there when I first got back. Maybe that was for the best. When she did show up, she tried to act like it was all a big misunderstanding. Can you believe that? As if I hadn't seen what I'd seen with my own eyes. Her words were empty, just noise without meaning. My heart, once full of love for her, was now just a pit of anger and hurt. I couldn't contain it. I was like a storm, raging through the house. I smashed a vase we'd picked out together on one of our trips. I tore down the photos, each one a stab in the heart. The place we'd called home was now just a cage of memories, each one a bitter reminder of what I'd lost. Then came Monday, back at work. Seeing him, the supervisor, sitting there like nothing had happened, it was too much. I saw red. Before I knew it, I was on him, fists flying. I didn't care about the consequences, didn't care about anything. All the pent-up rage, the feeling of being made a fool, it all just exploded. Of course, that was the end of my job. They escorted me out, and I left without a word. It didn't matter. What was a job compared to your whole life falling apart? The drive home was a blur. I was numb, detached from everything and everyone. The following days were a mix of rage and emptiness. I moved like a ghost through the house, through life. Everything I'd built, everything I'd believed in, it felt like a lie. I was a stranger in my own life. She was still there in the house. We avoided each other, two strangers under the same roof. When we did cross paths, it was like navigating a minefield. Each word, each glance loaded with unspoken accusations and pain. I remember one night, sitting in the dark, the silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. I thought about everything we'd been through, all the promises we'd made. And for what? To end up like this, broken, betrayed, alone in the dark. But anger, it's a funny thing. It burns hot and fierce, but it can't last forever. Slowly, it started to fade, leaving behind a deep, aching sadness. I started to see things more clearly, started to accept the reality of what had happened. The reality was our marriage was over. The trust, once broken, couldn't be mended. The love, once so bright, had faded into nothing. It was time to face that, time to start thinking about what came next. But moving on, it's not like flipping a switch. You don't just wake up one day and everything's fine. It's a process, a slow, painful crawl out of the darkness. And I was just at the beginning. Filing for divorce felt like admitting defeat. It was waving the white flag after years of battling for a marriage that, in the end, couldn't be saved. The paperwork, the legalities, it was all just a formality, a cold, bureaucratic process for something that once held so much warmth and love. But the real kicker? We were still living in the same house, a situation that was nothing short of a daily torture. The place that once echoed with our laughter now resounded with the heavy silence of our broken relationship. I'd see her around, sometimes catching a glimpse of her getting ready for a date, and it felt like being punched in the gut every single time. She wasn't discreet about her new flings. I'd hear her laughing on the phone, or she'd come home late, that look on her face that I used to think was reserved just for me. It was a constant, stinging reminder of how far we'd fallen, of everything that we'd lost. The house, once our sanctuary, had become a prison of memories. Every room, every piece of furniture, held a story, a moment from our past. I'd sit in our living room, staring at the empty chair where she used to curl up with a book, and feel this overwhelming sense of loss. Trying to find a new place was a battle in itself. My finances were a mess after losing the job, and the market wasn't kind. It was this endless loop of viewings and applications, each rejection a small echo of the bigger rejection I was already grappling with. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. The divorce proceedings seemed to drag on forever. It was a maze of legal terms, meetings with lawyers, and endless paperwork. Each signature felt like signing off a part of myself, a part of a life that I was still struggling to let go of. I'd come home to an empty house, or worse, to the sounds of her entertaining someone in what used to be our bedroom. The walls of that house felt like they were closing in on me, a constant, suffocating reminder of my failure. It wasn't just the loss of the marriage, but the loss of myself. I'd look in the mirror and barely recognize the man staring back. Where there used to be ambition and laughter, there was now just this hollow emptiness. My friends tried to be supportive, but there's only so much they could do. They'd invite me out, try to distract me, but it was like I was there in body but not in spirit. I was living in this fog, going through the motions of life without really living. As the divorce inched closer to being final, I found myself grappling with a mix of emotions. Relief that it was almost over, sadness for what had been lost, and a deep, gnawing fear of what the future held. It was during those long, lonely nights in that house, listening to the silence or the sounds of her life moving on without me, that I realized this was the end of a chapter. A painful, heart-wrenching chapter, but just a chapter nonetheless. There was still the rest of my story to be written, even if I couldn't see how just yet. The day I moved out felt like the end of a long, grueling marathon. The divorce was inked and dried, the last of our shared belongings awkwardly split. Stepping out of that house for the last time, I couldn't help but feel this strange mix of relief and overwhelming sadness. I found a small apartment, nothing fancy, just a place to start over. The walls were bare, the rooms echoed with emptiness, kind of like how I felt inside. Unpacking was a trip down memory lane, each item a reminder of a life that was no longer mine. It was surreal, setting up this new place, a home that was just mine, not ours. The first few nights were the hardest. The silence was deafening. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past years replaying in my mind. The laughter, the tears, the betrayal. It all seemed like a dream, a bad one that I couldn't wake up from. Becoming a single man again after all those years was a strange transition. There were no more arguments, no more painful silences, but also no more shared smiles, no more quiet moments of intimacy. I found myself missing even the bad parts, simply because they were familiar. I tried to throw myself into work, into rebuilding a life, but it was like learning to walk again. I'd lost not just a wife but a part of my identity. Who was I if not her husband? It was a question that haunted me. The bitterness was hard to shake off. I became more cynical, more guarded. Trusting someone again felt like an impossible task. I'd look at couples and feel this pang of something: envy, sadness, maybe a bit of both. Friends and family were supportive, encouraging me to get back out there, but they didn't understand. It wasn't just about finding someone new. It was about healing, about figuring out how to trust and love again after it had all been shattered. In quieter moments, I'd reflect on everything that had happened. Sure, there were signs I should have seen, moments when I should have walked away. But life isn't lived in hindsight. We make the best decisions we can with the information we have at the time. Now, it's about rebuilding, but it's slow going. Some days I feel like I'm making progress, finding pieces of the old me, the one who believed in love and happiness. Other days, it's like I'm stuck, unable to move forward, caught in the memories of what was. The hardest part is accepting that the reflection in the mirror has changed. I'm not the same man I was when I walked down that aisle. The experiences, the pain, the betrayal, it's all etched into who I am now. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Maybe this new version of me will be wiser, stronger, more resilient. So, here I am, standing at the start of a new chapter in my life. The road ahead is uncertain, maybe a little scary, but it's mine to walk. And who knows, maybe along the way, I'll find pieces of happiness, moments of peace, and perhaps, eventually, a reflection I can recognize. I looked at the faded black and white photograph that had fallen out of my grandfather's old book. I recognized my grandfather immediately. He was dressed in an army uniform, and his cap sat on his head at a careless angle. Standing next to him was an attractive woman in a long skirt, blouse, and jacket typical of the time. I looked at the back of the photo and saw the handwritten inscription, Grove and Doris, Hawaii, 1946. Grove was my grandfather's name, Grover Harrison. But to me, he was always just Pops. So who was Doris, I wondered. I knew it wasn't my grandmother. Her name was Patricia. I had never heard my grandfather mention anyone named Doris. Perhaps she was just his girlfriend from the war. I decided to ask him about it the next time I saw him, which was to be the same day. I put everything in place and headed for my apartment, which took up the entire basement of Grandpa's house. I had moved here at his insistence a few months ago when he went into a nursing home. The way he explained it made sense. He wanted someone to keep an eye on things while he was gone, and it would save me money. For several years now, my grandfather has suffered from a number of health problems. Fortunately, Alzheimer's or dementia were not among them. However, it had gotten to the point where he could no longer do the things he used to do, and since my parents had passed away, there was no one to take care of him the way he needed. Sure, he had cleaners come once a week and gardeners once a week to tend to the yard, but it wasn't enough. I did what I could, but during the week I worked. He needed constant care at this point, especially since he was now confined to a wheelchair all day long. It's not easy to move around when you're 99 years old, he said in his Minnesota accent. That's when things start to break down. So I showered, grabbed a snack, and headed to the nursing home. When I got there, I waved to the nurses at the front desk and signed in. How is my grandfather today? I asked Julie, the nurse at the desk. Frisky as always, she said with a smile. I smiled back. Did he try to stroke your ass again? I asked. Of course, she said. He does it every morning when I bring him breakfast. I laughed and headed for his private room. Hey, Trey. Come on in, son, he said when I knocked on his half-open door. That's me, by the way, Trey Harrison. I walked in and gave him a manly hug. Hey, Pops, I said. How are you feeling this morning? Oh, I guess on a medium level, he said. We talked a little about various things, fishing, news, the general state of the union. Then I pulled out a picture. What have you got there, son? He asked. I handed him the phone and watched his face change. His face reflected a multitude of emotions, sadness, anger, and maybe a little guilt. He lowered his eyes and held the picture back out. Where did you find this? He asked. She fell out of your old military handbook, I said. I was just curious who she was. I've never heard you mention anyone named Doris before. Was she a girlfriend or something? Okay, he said. I thought I'd gotten rid of all the pictures of her. Apparently not. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't mean to bring up bad memories. It's all right, son, he said. I think if anyone has a right to know about her, it's you. Look, why don't you get us each a cup of coffee? Then close the door and I'll tell you about her. Sure thing, Pops, I said. I grabbed a cup of coffee for each of us, decaf for him, then closed the door and sat back down. As I got up, I turned on the audio recorder on my phone, hoping I had enough space to record the whole thing. Thanks, son, he said as I handed him the cup. He gathered his thoughts for a bit before continuing. Just so you know, you're the only person I'm telling this to. I don't care if you write it down for yourself, but it is absolutely not to be repeated to anyone. Ever. Do you understand me? Sure, Pops, I said. I'm writing it down, but it's just for me. Good, he said. He took a sip of coffee and looked up for a moment before continuing. Grove's narration, transcribed from the audio recording. Perhaps I should start at the beginning. I was halfway through my junior year of college when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor. Like everyone else, I went to enlist in the army. Unfortunately, I was unable to do so because of my flat feet. They had never bothered me before, but I didn't argue. So I went back to school and got a degree in physics. After I graduated in 1943, I was approached by the government, if you can believe it. Said they needed my expertise for a new project. Apparently, my flat feet were no longer a problem. So I agreed and signed my name. I quickly went through officer candidate school, was promoted to second lieutenant, assigned to the Army Corps of Engineers, and was assigned to Project Manhattan. I was shocked when I was told what it was. Who would have thought of using nuclear material to build a bomb? It was an exciting time. I got to work with some of the most famous scientists of the time, including J. Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi. I learned more from them than I did during my entire college years. I was one of over 400 people at the Alamogordo test site when the first bomb test was conducted. We didn't even know if the damn thing would work. But it did, and the world changed that day. I was sent to Tinian, an island in the Pacific, where I was to help set and load the bomb that would be used on Hiroshima. We all hoped it would work and force the Japanese to surrender. The bomb did work, but they did not surrender. 3 days later, we sent another bomb, this time to Nagasaki. We all realized that the stakes were high. If the bomb didn't work, or if the Japanese didn't surrender, we would have to send our guys in to take the country by force. And if that happened, we knew the casualties would be extremely high. Fortunately, it worked. The next day, the Japanese offered to surrender. On August 12th, the United States said it would accept the surrender offer. In early September, the official surrender ceremony took place. I stayed on Tinian for a while and participated in the damage assessment of the Nagasaki attacks. I still have nightmares about it. It wasn't just the physical damage that tormented me. It was bad enough. I saw the survivors and what they had to face. Yes, I was proud that I helped end the war, but I wasn't proud that the 2 bombs I helped deliver to Japan killed over 100,000 people. That still bugs me to this day. I filed reports, and in February 1946, I was transferred to the unit that became Army and Navy Joint Task Force No. 1. About the time news broke about a Soviet spy group in Canada, causing a bit of a stir. I went to Hawaii and vacationed there for a while, and that's where I met her. She introduced herself to me as Doris Hastings, originally from Norman, Oklahoma. She was a delightful woman and very beautiful. We spent a lot of time together, dancing and kissing on the beach. Of course, she could do more than dance. The things this woman did with her mouth drove me crazy. We had what you might call a whirlwind romance, and we were married before a justice of the peace in April 1946. Later that year, I participated in Operation Crossroads, which consisted of 2 nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll. A 3rd test was planned, but it was canceled. In 1947, I re-enlisted in the service and was assigned to a joint nuclear testing operation in Nevada. Doris and I moved to what was then the city of Las Vegas, as it was only an hour away from where the new test center was to be located. Believe me, it was nothing compared to what it is now. Anyway, we went on with our lives, and I thought everything was fine between us. But one day, coming home from a test site, I saw Doris's car parked at a motel on the outskirts of town. I think it was 1948. My memory isn't what it used to be. What was she doing there, I wondered. I could think of only one reason why she might have been at the motel, and it wasn't a good one. I stopped recording when the nurse knocked on the door. My dad and I looked up and saw a young woman enter the room. She walked up to my grandfather and smiled at him. "Are you ready for therapy, Mr. Harrison?" she asked. "Only if you take me," he said with a smile and a wink. I couldn't help but smile as I watched the old man flirt with the young nurse. She smiled back and unlocked the wheels and started nudging him towards the door. "I'm going to be a little busy for a while, son," he told me. "Come back tomorrow and we'll talk some more." "Sure, Dad," I said, hugging him goodbye. "Take care of my grandpa," I said to the nurse. "Sure," she said. I left the room and headed home. I went through his things, trying to find any information about this woman, but found nothing. I looked through all of his old papers, seeing lots of commendations, certificates, awards, but nothing that even mentioned this Doris. Not an old marriage certificate, not any records related to the house in Las Vegas. Of course, if there was anything left, it's probably long gone by now, I thought. I looked at my watch and remembered that I had a date with Karen that evening, so I packed up and went to pick her up. We had been seeing each other exclusively for the past few months, and I was almost ready to pop the question to her. She looked good as always, wearing a fairly short green dress that emphasized her eyes and fiery red hair. She was also showing off what Daddy called great buttocks. As we sat in the Texas Roadhouse restaurant and ate, she looked at me with concern. "Are you okay, Trey?" she asked. "You seem like you're a million miles away." "I went to see my dad today," I said. "Is he all right?" she asked. "Yeah, feisty as always," I said. "What's the problem?" she asked, expressing concern. "I found this today in one of his old books from the war," I said, pulling the picture out of my pocket. She looked at it for a moment before she spoke. "Is that your grandfather?" she asked. I nodded my head. "A handsome man. I can see where you get your looks from. He reminds me of the actor Errol Flynn." "Who's the woman with him?" "Her name was Doris. Dad said he was married to her before he married my grandmother," I said. "Funny, I don't remember him ever mentioning her before. My parents never mentioned her either." I looked but couldn't find anything in his things that mentioned her. No letters, no notes, no cards, nothing. "And you know how he holds on to everything." "That sounds like a mystery to me," she said. "So are you going to play Sam Spade now?" I laughed. "No, but I'm curious," I said. "I mean, what happened to her?" "I have people I know who make a living searching public records," she said. "I can make a couple calls and see what happens, if that helps. If he was married to this woman, we should be able to find something." "What was her name?" "He said it was Doris Hastings, and she's supposedly from Norman, Oklahoma," I said. "If there is something, I'm sure we can find it," she said. "That would be great," I said. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said with a smile. "So what did your grandfather do during the war?" "He says he was involved in the Manhattan Project," I said. "Isn't that the group that dropped the bomb on Japan?" she asked. I nodded my head. "Wow," she said. "Yes," I said. "He's never talked about it before. I know he worked for the government until the late 60s and then went into teaching. That's where he met my grandmother." Karen said. "Interesting." We left that topic and finished dinner, then went out for drinks, dancing, and finally back to my house, where she reminded me again why I found her so alluring and sexy. The next morning, she woke up early and headed upstairs to make us a light breakfast. I rolled out of bed and went upstairs after doing my morning chores and throwing on my robe. As I went upstairs, I saw her in just her apron buttering some bagels. Pressing myself against her firm and appetizing rear end, I kissed her. "Watch this," she said, laughing. She handed me a bagel, which I gladly accepted. I poured each of us a cup of coffee and we sat down to eat in the breakfast nook. "Why are you up so early?" I asked. "Well, I need to get home to get ready for work," she said. I knew she worked at the DMV office. Her job had her in front of people most of the day, renewing car registrations and the like. "Why don't you move some stuff in here so you don't have to leave so early?" I asked. "Trey, that sounds almost like a commitment," she said with a smile. "Are you sure about that?" "Absolutely," I said, kissing her hand. "I could get used to waking up with this every morning." "Yes," she asked. "Well, you know what they say about redheads, right? You've never seen me lose my temper." "Then I'll have to be on my best behavior," I told her. "Damn right," she said with a smile. "I guess we could try it if you really want to up the ante. So what's on your plate tonight?" "I have a server installation this morning," I said. "If all goes well, I'll be done with it in about 2 hours and then I'll go see Paps. I want to hear more of his story." "Okay," she said. "Don't forget, I'll be at my mom's after work. She promised to help me with something I'm working on. I'll call you tonight. Okay?" "Sounds like a plan," I said. "Tell your mom I said hi." "I will," she said. "Mom really likes you, you know." "Yeah, I like her too. She reminds me of you for some reason," I said, making her laugh. "Are we still working this weekend?" she asked. "Remember when you promised to take a rematch from me at the miniature golf course?" "Sure," I said. "Maybe we can visit Daddy if you want." "Of course," she said. "You know all he does is look at my feet, right?" I ran my hand down one of her legs. Can you blame the old man? Asked I. I like to look at those legs myself. You're such a naughty boy, she joked. Only with you, I said, eliciting a smile. After we finished breakfast, she went downstairs, put on her clothes, and walked out. I kissed her at the door and watched her get in her car and drive away. I went back into the kitchen and poured some cereal into a bowl. Karen was a wonderful woman, but she ate like a bird. I finished my cereal and went downstairs to get ready for the day. I only had one server to install, and that suited me just fine. I had been self-employed as an IT consultant for the past few years, mostly doing work for various computer manufacturers. They would provide the equipment, set up appointments, and I would do the work, as well as the maintenance that the client agreed to. The customer paid the manufacturer, and the manufacturer in turn paid me. The hours were good, the pay was great, and I liked the boss, a man whose face I saw every morning in the mirror. The installation went as I planned, and by 14 o'clock everything was ready and working as it should. The customer signed the statement of work, satisfied that the new system was installed. I jumped in my work truck, scanned the paperwork with the portable scanner, emailed it to the manufacturer, and headed to Pabst. Hey Dad, I said, hugging him. How are you doing? Oh, medium pace, I think, he said in that accent I loved so much. I suppose you want to hear more about Doris? Yes, I said. If you don't mind? Of course, he said. Have some coffee and I'll tell you some more. I poured each of us a cup of coffee and put his cup in the holder attached to his chair. I sat down and started the recorder. So where was I? Asked Pabst. You just saw Doris's car for the first time at the motel, I said. Oh yes, he said. He closed his eyes and thought for a moment before continuing. Grove continues his narrative. After seeing Doris's car outside the motel that first day, I went home distraught. She had never let me know that she was unhappy in our marriage. She was always loving and warm. I didn't even realize there was a problem. I guess it's true that the husband is always the last to know about these things. I knew I needed to get more information before I did anything rash. First, I needed to act normal, and that wasn't easy. I was hurt, humiliated, and more than a little upset. It would be very difficult for me to react normally to her if she was actually cheating. I also knew I had to take decisive action, given the delicacy of my position. Something like this could be used against me by a hostile foreign power. I had gone through all the security briefings and had heard that this was the kind of thing the Reds like to use as blackmail. I took out the phone book and looked up private investigator. I called one named James Ham and spoke to his secretary. She put me through to him, and I made an appointment with him for the morning. The next call was to my boss. I explained the situation to him, and he agreed that I needed to deal with it, so he gave me the day off. Shortly after I finished talking, Doris drove up to the house. She came in with a bag of groceries and set it on the kitchen table. I looked closely but didn't see anything unusual. Her clothes looked fresh. Her makeup wasn't messed up, and her hair looked as good as the last time I saw her. She came over and kissed my cheek, and I didn't smell anything strange. So, how was your day? She asked. Okay, I guess I told her. Even though she was my wife, I was forbidden to give details of my work, so I often spoke in generalities. Just taking care of things as they come. How about you? Same thing, she said. Did some shopping, then went to the store and got something for dinner. So you didn't go anywhere or meet anyone today? I asked. No, nothing else, she said. Why? Couldn't believe it. She had just lied to my face. How long has she been lying to me like that, I thought. Oh, nothing, I'm just curious, that's all, I said. Shit. Shit? Shit? Shit. What do you have in store for tomorrow? Probably the same, she said. I bet it is, I thought to myself. I changed into civilian clothes and joined her at the table for dinner. After dinner, we took some sherry and sat down to watch television. We had bought one of the first mass-produced televisions, an old RCA. In those days, there wasn't as much exciting stuff as there is today, but we enjoyed the old craft television theater. Milton Berle was a favorite of ours too, and I always liked the old Superman and Life of Riley series. The old hidden camera came out around that time too, I think. They don't make those anymore, I'll tell you that. Anyway, we watched a little TV and then went to bed. It was hard for me to try to be the same with her that night, but I managed. I think Doris noticed that something was wrong, but she didn't say anything. The next day we had breakfast as usual. I put on my uniform, grabbed a cup of coffee and headed outside. I didn't want her to think I was doing anything different, so I stopped at the diner for a coffee before meeting James. I got to his office and was ushered in by a blonde woman chewing gum in the reception area. James looked up when I walked in, stood up and shook my hand. He sat back down, lit a cigarette, and looked at me through the smoke. "So, what can I do for you today, Captain Harrison?" he asked, referring to my rank, looking at the papers on his desk. I told him about seeing Doris's car at the motel and explained that my job was very sensitive, without specifying exactly what it was. "So, you suspect your wife is running after you and you want me to get to the bottom of it, right?" he asked. "Yes, it is," I said. "All right," he said. "Give me everything you have on her, a picture, make of car, license plate number, and so on, and then give me a week or so to see what I can come up with. I like to know as much as I can about her, so I'll call my colleagues in Hawaii and Oklahoma and see what we can come up with. It'll take a few days and cost a little more if that's okay with you." "Yes, of course," I said. "Don't forget that we didn't have all those fancy gadgets and gimmicks that you young people take for granted today." "No, Siri. In those days, a detective had to work hard to get the goods." I gave him information about her car, color, make, and license plate number, and then I handed him a picture. "The one you found." He furrowed his eyebrows, looking at it. I didn't understand why at the time, but I would later. "Okay," James said. "In the meantime, don't do anything stupid. Let me do my job. Could be nothing. Maybe she's seeing an old friend or family member. Are you thinking about divorce?" "I don't know," I said. "I guess it depends on what you find out." "Okay," he said, holding out a business card to me. "This is the name of a lawyer I highly recommend. My secretary will handle my prepayment. I like to have some kind of prepayment to get started, and then I'll bill you for the rest when I'm done. Deal?" "Yeah, it's okay," I said. "Call me in, say, 10 days, and I'll have a full report," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Ham," I said. "You're welcome, and good luck to you, Captain," he said, standing up and extending his hand to me. I shook it, then walked out and settled in at the receptionist's desk. I looked at the card and asked for directions, which the receptionist happily provided. I pulled up to a small house on the edge of downtown that had a sign on it that read, "Wilbur Capshaw, attorney at law. Divorces are settled quickly here." In those days, Nevada was considered the divorce capital of the country. I parked and went inside, where another blonde secretary ushered me into the office of Wilbur Capshaw, Esquire. I couldn't help but wonder if blondes grow on trees here. Wilbur stood up, shook my hand as I entered, and asked me to sit down. "What can I do for you, Captain?" he asked. "Well," I said, "I'm thinking about getting a divorce and wanted to know what my options are." "You've come to the right place," he said. "Are you looking for a quick Reno-style divorce?" "I'd like it to be quick," I said. "I can easily handle it," he said. "On what grounds do you want a divorce?" "Probably adultery," I said. "I'm not sure yet." "Oh?" he asked. "Why not?" "Well, I don't have conclusive evidence yet," I said. "I had someone check it out for me." "By someone, do you mean Mr. Ham?" he asked. "He called and said you might come in. I've got a lot of business from him." "Yes," I said. He nodded his head. "So how does it work?" I asked him. "How long have you been here in Nevada?" he asked. "A few months since I was assigned here last year," I told him. "Good," Wilbur said. "So there's no problem with residency. According to the law, you only have to have lived here for 6 weeks. Can you get someone to testify that you've been here all that time?" "Absolutely," I said. "Even better," he said. "Basically, it works like this. Once you decide to do it, come to me. I'll prepare the paperwork, file it with the court, and deliver it. And then I'll hire an attorney in Reno to go to court with you. You will have to get there on your own, either by car or train. I suspect you already have a car, right?" "Yeah, I know," I said, nodding my head. "You will then enter the courthouse. You or your attorney will state your case. And if she doesn't contest it, You will walk out a few minutes later, a free man with a divorce decree in your hands. Later, if you want, you can even throw your wedding ring into the Truckee River. Just like that? I asked. Pretty much, he said. Well, I want to see what Mr. Ham finds first, I said. I understand, Wilbur said. You don't want to get off halfway. But just so you know, you can still divorce her. Hell, I know a guy who divorced his wife because she wouldn't let him listen to the radio. Wow, I said. Yes, Wilbur said. He called it cruelty, if you can believe that. Take your time, make sure it's what you need, and then come see me. I'll still be here. Thank you, Mr. Capshaw, I said. Perhaps I will. My pleasure, Captain, he said as he stood up. We shook hands and I left. Back in the car, I realized it was time for lunch. So I went back to the diner to eat and contemplate my actions. I ate my lunch and pondered what I had done wrong. I always put her above me and did my best to treat her with respect and love. How could she do something like this? Before I knew it, it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I couldn't sit here all day, and I didn't feel like getting drunk at all. I had an idea and headed for the exit, paying the bill and leaving a nice tip for the waitress, who had been so patient with me. I drove past the motel where I'd seen her parked before, and didn't see her car. Good, I thought. I decided to drive home and surprise her. But when I pulled up to our house, I saw a strange car with California license plates parked in the driveway. I pulled into the driveway and parked next to Doris's car, then headed for the door. Dad and I looked up when we heard a knock on the door, interrupting his story. I turned off the tape when a nurse came through the door. Time to get you ready for dinner, Mr. Harrison, she said affectionately. He smiled back at her. All ready? He asked. God, time flies when you're having fun. I stood up and hugged Paps. Then I'd better go, I said. I'll come tomorrow if you don't mind. That's more than good, son, he said. See you later. I nodded to the nurse as I left and headed home. Once there, I checked my schedule for the next day, which was Friday. I didn't have any installations scheduled, but I did have some maintenance work scheduled. That could be done remotely. I sat down at my computer and started searching. I found some old articles mentioning James Ham, and learned that he had served in the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, during the war. The OSS, as I knew from a documentary I once saw on the History Channel, was the predecessor to the CIA. I also found mention of Capshaw, a divorce lawyer who made a lot of money in the 1940s and 1950s from quick divorces. Don't get me wrong. I never had any reason to doubt my grandfather. I just wanted to find something, anything at all, to corroborate his story. After dinner, I got a call from Karen. She was at her mother's house working on some project of her own. She loved to crochet and often turned to her mother, who was an expert, for help. So how did it go with your grandfather today? She asked. That went well, I said. I'll probably come by tomorrow afternoon when I'm done. Okay, she said. Don't forget we have a date tomorrow night. How could I forget something like that? I asked. To this she giggled. By the way, my mom said to say hi to you, she said. I heard her mom in the background yell out, Hi, Trey. I laughed. Say hi to your mom, I said to Karen. I heard her turn to her mother. Trey said to tell you hi, Mom, she said, and turned to the phone again. By the way, Trey Harrison, she began. I love you. I know I don't tell you this as often as I should, but I love you. I love you too, Karen, I said. Karen had been hurt a lot in the past, and she wasn't the type to express love on short notice. I felt truly blessed that she felt as if she could say that to me, and in fact I really did love her. I'll see you tomorrow night, okay? She asked. I'll see you then, I said. We said goodbye and ended the conversation. The next day I finished work earlier than I had anticipated. I checked my schedule for the next week, sent in my timesheets to get my paycheck, and went to see Paps. I wanted to hear the rest of his story. When I arrived at the nursing home, I said hello to Julie, who smiled as I checked in, and then went to his room. I gave him a proper hug and poured them each a cup of coffee, placing his cup in a coaster. "So how are you doing with that redhead?" he asked. "What's her name? Karen?" "Yes, Dad, this is Karen, and things are going really well between us," I said. "Are you thinking about marrying her?" my dad asked. I nodded my head. "I think so, Pops," I said. He nodded his head and smiled. "You know, I wouldn't mind if you wanted to move it to the old place," he said with a wink. "You mean living in sin?" I asked sarcastically, feigning shock. He laughed. "I may be old, but I'm not stupid," he said. "She's a good influence on you, son. And I know your grandmother would approve, too." "Thanks, Dad," I said. "I just wish Mom and Dad were still here." He smiled and patted my knee. "I know, son," he said. "I do too. But it's time for you to look to the future. And I think Karen should be a part of that future. But that's not why you're here, is it?" I smiled. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. "Let me see. Where was I just now?" "You just pulled up in front of your house and saw a strange car out front," I said. Having read several stories on the internet, I was well aware of the ordinariness of the strange car outside the house, as many authors had included it in their stories. "Oh yeah," he said. He gave me a moment to start recording before continuing. I parked the car and took a deep breath before entering the house. What will I find there? I thought to myself. Will she be in his arms? Would they have sex in my bed? I worked up the courage to get out of the car. I entered the house not knowing what I would find there. When I went inside, I saw a tall, well-built man in a dark suit sitting on a couch. He stood up when I came inside. Doris was in the kitchen making dinner. She came out when she heard the door open, and I saw her wiping her hands on the apron she wore over her house dress. "Grove, you're back early," she said. "I was just starting dinner. Please meet my cousin Michael J. Smith from Ardmore, Oklahoma." "Mike, this is my husband, Grove." The man held out his hand and I reluctantly shook it. I noticed the lipstick residue on his lips and noticed the small scar across his right cheek. "Nice to finally meet you," he said in flawless English. I thought that being from Oklahoma, he might have a slight Western accent, but that was not the case. That struck me as rather odd. But then again, I didn't meet people from Oklahoma that often. "Nice to meet you, Mike," I said. "Please have a seat. I'm just going to get rid of this uniform if you don't mind." "Not at all," he said with a smile. Something about that smile made me wary. Don't ask me what it was, but I felt uneasy. I opened the door to my office and put my briefcase on the floor, double-checking to make sure it was locked. I closed and locked the door, and then went to my bedroom to change. I listened to see if I could hear what they were saying, but I didn't. I looked around, but saw no sign that they were doing anything here. I changed into my uniform and went back to the front room. I poured myself a drink and noticed that Mike had already helped himself. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "Doris said I should help myself. Since you are her cousin, I see no need to state otherwise," I said. "What's the saying?"
Mi casa es su casa.
Mike looked confused for a moment before responding. Hadn't he heard that before? "Well, thank you," he finally said. We sat in the front room, and Doris stayed in the kitchen. "So what do you do, Mike?" I asked. "And what brings you to Las Vegas?" "Well, I'm a salesman," he said. "I spend a lot of time on the road, and I was just passing through here on my way to Reno. I'm sure it's not as interesting as what you do," he added, trying to encourage me to brag about my job. "Oh, I don't know," I said. "You travel a lot. You see new things all the time. And I'm stuck in the same old pile of dirt every day. So what are you selling?" "Mostly building materials," he said. "Nothing retail. Everything for contractors. You'd be surprised how much was built after the war." "I noticed the scar," I said. "Were you in the war?" "Yes," he said. "I got it from a Kraut bullet." Were you in the war? Yes, I told him. I spent time in the Pacific Theater. I'm sure I didn't see as much combat as you did in Europe. We all did our part, he said. Doris came out and called us to the table. We sat and ate, and I think I studied them almost as much as they studied me. I couldn't help but wonder if they were really cousins, or if it was just a story they told me to throw me off. When we finished, Mike stood up and kissed Doris on the cheek. I noticed the way she looked at him. Something about it didn't feel right. It was delightful, he said. We'll definitely do it again. He turned to me and held out his hand, which I accepted. I should be going now. Thank you for letting me share dinner with you, Grove. It was a pleasure to meet you. Likewise, I said. After he left, I helped Doris clear the table. And then, after pouring each of us a drink, I sat down in the front room. Nice guy, your cousin, I said as she sat down. Yes, thank you, she said. You two seemed very close, I said. We've always been close, she told me. You bet we have, I thought. I haven't seen him since he went off to war. I said. She looked at me strangely for a minute. You seem preoccupied with something, she said. Is everything okay? Sure, I said, just thinking about something that came up recently. But I'll deal with it. She smiled and hugged me as if nothing had happened. For the next few days, I was on alert, waiting to see what James would find out. Of course, I gave him all the information about Mike's description and the car he drove, as well as the California license plates. He nodded his head in thanks when I was done. Thank you, Captain Harrison, he said. That's very helpful. A few days later, I called James to see if he had any information for me. As a matter of fact, yes, Captain, he said. Would you mind stopping by on your way home from work today? I'll be there, I said. I got out a little early and went into his office. His secretary ushered me inside right away. Good to see you, Captain, he said, lighting a cigarette. So what did you find out? I asked anxiously. A few things, he said. First, my colleague in Hawaii checked the paperwork. Did you see the judge who married you sign the marriage license? No, I said. When I looked at it, it was signed. He said he'd file it for me. Turns out there was no marriage certificate, James said. Never. In fact, the judge who supposedly married you was found dead of a gunshot wound a few days after your wedding. The truth is, according to the authorities, you were never married. What? I asked. That's not all, he said. The woman you know as Doris Hastings is actually Russian. Really? I asked. Are you sure? Absolutely, he said. I thought I recognized her face from the photograph you gave me. Her real name is Svetlana Fedorova, and she's a KGB agent. The last time I saw her was in Bavaria at the end of the war. I thought she'd been killed, but apparently not. The man you know as Michael Smith is actually Michel Schmidt, a former member of the Waffen-SS. There was talk in intelligence that he was recruited by Fedorova as a double agent and moved to the Soviet Union after the war. Wow, I said. Maybe we'd better call the FBI or someone. Generally speaking, I would agree, James said, but I'm afraid it could get you into a lot of trouble. Being duped by a Soviet spy won't reflect too well on your record. It could also cost you your security clearance and possibly your job. But I had no idea she was Russian, I said. Never mind, James said. I suspect they've chosen you for something. What exactly, I don't know. But I do know that they plan to kill you when they're done. I can also tell you that they've been quite active. He pulled out some black and white photos of the two of them, naked in a motel room. Where did you get them from? I asked. It's better you don't know, James said. But that's the least of your worries. Since your marriage isn't officially registered, there's no way you can divorce her. So what do we do? I asked. I have an idea that will take care of everything, he said with a sly smile. We talked and made plans for the next hour or so. Daddy stopped talking and looked up at me before he spoke. I saw a tinge of guilt and shame on his face. I stopped the tape. Everything all right, Pops? I asked. This next part is the hardest part in this whole story, he said. I hope you won't think badly of me after this. Dad, there's nothing you can say to change the way I feel about you, I said. He nodded his head. I hope you are, son, he said. I want you to know I'm not proud of what I did. It's okay, Pops, I said. All right, son. Here we go, he said. I started the tape again and waited for him to finish. I waited for the day of the next challenge, just as James and I had planned. He looked after Doris, Svetlana, and Mike and knew their routines well. Apparently Mike had a motel room and Doris went to see him almost every day. I called James and he informed me that the two of them were in a motel room and would probably be there for a few hours. It was not unusual for me to come home in a government truck. I used it a lot in my job when preparing test sites. You see, part of my job was to make sure everything was ready for each test. That meant I was the last one on the pad before detonation. When James told me where they were, I made sure I had the gear we had discussed earlier. I headed to the motel and met up with James. Luckily, their room was on the second floor and in the back of the motel. No one would see us enter or leave the room, he said. As we had planned, I wore green coveralls and a cap, so no one would recognize me as an army officer. Shoo, James said as I climbed out of the car. They're asleep right now. Get everything ready while I put them down. I nodded my head and quietly opened the back door of the truck. I pulled out the ramp and attached it to the back of the truck, and then opened the metal crate that was already standing inside. When I turned around, James was holding Doris Svetlana in a burlap sack over his shoulder. He tossed her into the crate. Is that her? I began. He shook his head. No, but she'll be gone for a few hours, he said. I'll be right back. A few minutes later, he returned with Mike and put his body in the box next to hers. Then he gathered up all the things that were in the room and put them in the box. I watched as he cuffed their hands behind their backs, making sure the chains were intertwined. He also stuffed their underwear in their mouths. I closed the box and locked it shut. They were so tightly crammed in that there was no way to move, much less escape. Finished with my work, I looked at my watch. Do you have time to get back before the exam? He asked. I nodded my head. Oh yes, I said. Let me know how it went, he said. I thanked him and left while he wiped down everything he touched. I arrived at the test site just in time to be escorted out by the military police. I thought you weren't going to make it, Cap, one of the guards said. Just wanted to grab a bite to eat before the test, I said. They quickly peered into the back of my truck and waved me over. Take care, Cap, the guard said and saluted. I saluted him back and headed inside. I made my way to the tent where the weapons were being prepared for testing. After finishing my part of the job, I sent everyone else on their way as usual. Fortunately, I was able to park my truck so that my movements would not be visible from the camera set up a few miles away. After making sure everyone else was gone, I drove the truck up to the tent, opened it, then lowered the ramp and took the dolly. Took some fiddling, but I managed to center the crate on the dolly. It wasn't easy, let me tell you. Doris Svetlana didn't weigh that much, but Mike weighed as much as I did, if not more. I finally pulled out the box under the scaffolding that held the weapon, and noticed that there was a metal plate running along the scaffolding underneath the bomb, probably to support the structure. At least it was hiding what was under the weapon, which was all I cared about. I unlocked the crate and opened it slightly. They started to wake up and blink their eyes a few times before they recognized me. They were both very surprised to see me when I knelt down over them. So, I said, I understand you wanted a good look at our atomic technology. Well, here you go. It's really not much more powerful than the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it'll do. If it's any consolation, you won't feel a thing when it goes off. 1 second you'll be here and the next you'll be gone. That's it, I added, snapping my fingers. I realized that Doris Svetlana wanted to say something, so I pulled the gag out of her mouth. You imperialist pig, she hissed. I shoved Mike's underwear back into her mouth and laughed. You lying, cheating communist bitch, I said in reply. I know all about you and Comrade Schmidt. You have about 15 minutes to come to terms with what you commies worship. By the way, I want a divorce. Goodbye and enjoy hell. Her eyes widened as I slammed the drawer shut and locked it shut. I knew there was no way they could escape. After replacing the cart, I removed the tarp tent and stuffed it into another metal box, then loaded it into my truck like I always did. I took one last look around and then left the site the same way I came in. Just like I always did. My hands were shaking and everything inside was shaking. When I reached the guarded observation deck, I took a few deep breaths and calmed down a little before I parked the truck and stepped inside. I joined the rest of the observers, grabbing my protective gear, and we took the usual precautions. Soon I heard the countdown and realized that in a few seconds all hell would break loose. And so it did. I knew that Doris Svetlana and her accomplice had already vaporized and would never be seen or heard from again. Like everyone else, I waited a bit before looking, and then I saw a mushroom cloud rising into the sky. Using binoculars, I looked at what was supposed to be ground zero. I don't know why. I knew there would be no evidence of what I had done there, yet I was compelled to look. When everything quieted down, I went through the monitoring stations like everyone else, then returned the truck and got into my car. I was still shaking when I got home. I had never done anything like that in my life, and I knew I was going to hell. It's over, I told James when I called him from home. All right, he said. Give it a day or so, then report her missing. If you need to talk, let me know. I will, I said. Thanks for everything, he laughed. Wait until you get my bill, he said. I laughed for the first time that day. Dad stopped talking and looked at me, guilt and sadness in his eyes. I stopped the tape. It's okay, Pops, I said, hugging him. You said yourself that they were planning to kill you when they were done. Not only did you save your life, but you protected the country from 2 hostile foreign agents. You have nothing to be ashamed of. He nodded his head. I've been telling myself that ever since, he said, and it still weighs on me, you know. I know, Dad, I said, but we were at war, remember? You did what you had to do. It was either you or them, and personally I'm glad you did. Otherwise, you and I would never have met. As I looked at him, a tear appeared in his eyes and he smiled. I never thought about it, son, he said. You know, you're the bravest man I've ever met, Pops, I said. I'm proud of you. He hugged me tightly and I felt his tears soak my shirt. After a few minutes, he wiped his eyes and looked at me. The guilt and sadness was gone. Maybe telling you about it is what I've needed all these years, he said. I've been carrying it around ever since. I'm curious, I said. What happened next? I waited a couple days and then filed a missing persons report, he said. They came back a few days later and said her car was found at a motel, but they found no sign of her. They said she may have met someone and left with them. They said I'd probably never hear from her again. We both laughed. That would have been one hell of a phone call, I said, making him laugh out loud. What happened after that? A few months passed and at James's suggestion, I went to Capshaw's, he said. James and I decided it would be best for me to act like the marriage was real, even though we knew it wasn't. Capshaw filed for divorce, citing being abandoned. I drove to Reno, and in a few minutes it was settled. On the way out of town, I stopped and threw the ring into the Truckee River, as he had suggested. For the next few years, I was halfway expecting federal agents to come to me, but they never did. In the 1960s, I retired from government service and took a job as a teacher. That's where I met Patricia. The rest is history. How did she keep in touch with her superiors? I asked. He shrugged. I don't know, he said, and I never found out. I guess it doesn't matter now, does it? I guess not, I said. Our visit was interrupted when a nurse knocked on the door. She came in and announced that it was time for dinner, and I said goodbye. Be sure to bring your charming girlfriend to us, he told me. I will, Dad, I said. Maybe tomorrow if you don't mind. I'm looking forward to it, he said. That night, Karen and I went out for dinner, drinks, and dancing. She took a few things with her, including a large paper bag, with something inside that she said was a surprise. Later, after we made love in my apartment, she turned to me. Are you okay, Trey? She asked. Yeah, why do you ask? I asked her. Well, it just seems like you're a million miles away, she said. What's on your mind? I stopped by to see Dad today, I said. He told me the rest of his story. I briefly remembered what he'd told me. Wow, she said. Remind me never to get on his bad side. I chuckled. We'll go see him tomorrow. Maybe after I kick your ass on the miniature golf course? Sure, if you want, I said. The next day we played a game of miniature golf. And yes, she beat me. And no, I didn't let her. She would have realized that right away. Later, we went to Daddy's house. She took her bag with her and carried it to the nursing home. His eyes lit up when he saw us coming in. Hello, young lady, he said as she hugged him tightly. I have something for you, she said, holding out a paper bag to him. He opened it and pulled out a plastic blanket container that contained an Afghan. She helped him open it and pulled out the Afghan. I just finished these the other day, she said. I know you like Afghans, so I made one for you. He smiled, holding it in his hands. It's wonderful, he said. Thank you, I really like it. He turned to look at me. Son, if you don't marry this girl, I will, he declared. You're right, Pops, I said. I took one of Karen's hands in mine and knelt down in front of her, right next to Grandpa. I looked into her eyes.
Karen, I said.
I love you madly, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? She looked surprised at first, but then she smiled broadly. She put her arms around my neck and kissed my face. Oh yes, Trey, she said. I'm going to marry you. I love you so much. I love you too, I said. We heard clapping from the door. And when we turned around, we saw several nurses clapping and smiling. Dad joined in too. A couple months later, we were married, and the nursing home brought my grandfather to the church so he could celebrate with us. He handed me an envelope containing first-class airfare to Las Vegas and a reservation at the best hotel. After a few months, his health deteriorated so badly that he was moved to the hospice wing of the nursing home. Karen and I spent as much time with him as we could. I could see that although his body was shutting down, his mind was still very active. I could also tell that he no longer felt any guilt for what he had done. On my last visit, he was sane enough to tell me that he had made his peace with God and was ready to join his beloved Patricia. Don't cry for me, son, he said quietly. We'll be together again, I promise. I love you, son. I hugged him as he let out his last breath. Couldn't hold back. I cried. I love you too, Daddy, I said between sobs. As I looked up at his face, I saw the easy, mischievous smile I had grown to love since I was a child. And I knew he was in a better place. Karen came into the house and hugged me as we both mourned his passing. He was buried in uniform with full military honors, next to his wife Patricia. The honor guard carefully folded the flag that draped his coffin and handed it to me along with a salute. He had fought for his country and deserved all the honors due him, I thought. A few days later, I received a letter from his lawyer asking me to stop by his office. I was curious to know what he wanted, so I went. Your grandfather left you everything, the lawyer said. The house, the money, everything. All in all, it's a substantial sum, even after his last expenses. If you'd like, I can assign you a financial advisor to help you manage it. He also asked me to give you this, he added, handing me a large sealed envelope that looked rather old. It's been stored in my safe for several years now. Don't ask me what's in it because I have no idea. Your grandfather said it could only be opened after he died. Thank you, I said. And yes, I'd like to meet with your financial advisor, I added, seeing the rather substantial amount of money Dad had left behind. I didn't open the envelope until after I got home. I was shocked at what I discovered. It seemed Pops had kept everything, including a copy of a report written by James Ham and a yellow divorce certificate declaring him free from one Doris Harrison, née Hastings, on the grounds of abandonment. There was even a photograph of the house in which they lived. That night, Karen and I went through it all, shaken. I guess everything my dad had told me was true. The last sheet turned out to be a photocopy of some old official report in Russian. It seemed to be something from a giant stash of documents issued by the old Soviet KGB. It had an English translation attached to it. As far as I could tell, it was a series of field reports by a certain Svetlana Fedorova, in which she informed her superiors in Moscow that she suspected that her target, that is, the Pope, might know her real identity. Her early reports stated only that she had become intimate with a man very familiar with American atomic weapons work. She never called Pops by name, but it was clear that she was frustrated, that she could not get anything useful out of him, and told her superiors that all he wanted to do was have sex and watch capitalist television. Later dispatches revealed even more frustration. Her superiors were telling her that she should be more aggressive in her actions. In the last dispatch, she reported that she and Michelle were planning something drastic. "I'll deal with him at the first opportunity," she told her superiors. Karen and I had a good laugh about that. The KGB report said that neither Fedorova nor her German-born assistant were ever heard from again. They even speculated that the two had run off to get married, but they just couldn't be found. The operation was stamped deceased. "They have no idea," I said, making Karen laugh. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and